Hello everyone, and welcome to today's edition of the Innovation Lunch Learn sessions. Today's session will be presented by Jacob Dutton from Future Foundry, and he will cover not only kind of the methodologies and strategies for innovation that drive today's transformation work, but he will cover some of the origins of innovation as well. So it promises to be a very exciting session. In terms of format, we will start with Jacob's presentation first, and then we will have a Q&A session at the end. If you do have questions, please put them in the chat as they occur, and then we will take them right at the end. And then the usual reminder, please stay on mute if you're not speaking. But without further ado, I will hand over to Jacob.
Cool. Hello, everyone. Really good to be here today. Thanks to the Lottie team and Genta for having me. Excited to look at the science of innovation with you today. For those of you that I've not met, hello, I'm Jacob. I've spent the last 17 years working very specifically in corporate innovation, so helping some of today's biggest companies, companies like Hilton, General Motors, HSBC, Walgreens, NBC Universal, to, I guess, overcome innovation inertia and to help them to invent new ventures, so new business models, to develop new products, to develop new services. Today, I run Future Foundry, so we're a growth incubator for global brands, and we help them to really kind of speed up, de-risk, systematize the way that they go about developing breakthrough new ventures. And we do that by, I guess, sort of utilizing the discovery, validation, go-to-market methods of Silicon Valley, and kind of breaking away from the traditional sort of management methods of the sort of 20th century. So we've not been around for long, only since 2021, but we've built around 100 new ventures in that time with our corporate partners. We've got a portfolio valuation on those ventures of around $15 billion, which represents around 300x return for our clients, which is something that we're super proud of. But today, let's take a look at what we're gonna run through. So I guess our belief at Future Foundry is that innovation is the result of a deeply scientific approach to new value creation. And to get into it, we're going to explore probably three big themes over the next sort of 40 minutes or so. So we'll look at how today's organizations can learn about innovation and take inspiration from some of the world's most famous explorers, scientists, inventors. We'll explore how some of the world's fastest growing companies are using these methods to successfully invent new ventures, products, and services. And we'll also look at why this scientific approach can help organizations of all sort of shapes and sizes, not necessarily corporates, to innovate with more focus, more speed, more certainty. So we'll wrap hopefully quite a way before 1 o'clock, and we'll leave some time for Q&A. So as Genta said, as we go, please feel free to drop those into the chat, and we'll get to as many of those as we can before the end of the session. I guess before we talk about innovation, I think the first really important thing to do is to define it, and just to define what it is we mean, because it's a term that gets thrown around quite a lot. I guess our definition of innovation here at Future Foundry is that it is the discipline through which we find new ways to create and capture value, right? So that could be a new business model, it could be a new product, it could be a new service that either helps an organization to unlock new growth, maybe to drive efficiencies if we're talking about process innovation, or to make customers, stakeholders happier. And we've seen a huge amount of innovation in business over the last decade, from literal kind of moonshots like SpaceX from Elon Musk to new ideas that solve problems and create new value like Uber, Netflix, Amazon. But I think one of the most enduring myths around innovation is that it is the result of some sort of inspired genius, right? A eureka moment. But in our experience, that isn't really how innovation happens. You know, innovation is the result of a deeply methodological sort of scientific approach to value creation. And today, I really want to sort of prove that to you. And there's a quote that we come back to here a lot at Future Foundry, and it says that there are decades where nothing happens, and that there are weeks where decades happen. And I think over the last sort of decade, if not the last sort of 18 months, feels as though we've had a succession of those weeks, right? At a personal level, professional level, societal level. And if you're an innovator within your organization, you'll recognize that there's a huge amount of change going on in terms of kind of the people that we serve, the competitors that we're up against, the technology that we're able to leverage, not least because of the huge sort of rollout, advancement, adoption in generative AI. But actually this accelerated rate of change that we think we're experiencing now has really been steadily increasing over the last sort of 500 years, really. So let's go right back and sort of take a look at why. So from the discovery in 1674 of microorganisms by Anton van Leeuwenhoek through to the development in 1945 of the atomic bomb, shown here at a test site in New Mexico, to the 1969 moon landings, none of these things would have been possible without a series of events that marked the emergence of modern science during that early modern period, when developments in math and physics, biology, chemistry, astronomy transformed the views of society about the world that we lived in and the world around us. And that was really the scientific revolution, right? And it's the scientific revolution that's enabled human beings to obtain just enormous new powers by investing resources in scientific research. And it's a revolution because until about 1500, as humans, we sort of thought that we knew everything that we needed to know, right? And everything that we didn't know was kind of taken care of by deities, by kings, by the paranormal. And before this, we really doubted our ability to obtain new medical, new military, new economic powers. Yes, there was sort of education of sorts, but really the aim of scholarship then was to preserve existing capabilities and pass those down through generations. Wasn't really to go and find new capabilities. And pre-modern rulers financed, people like priests, philosophers, poets to, I guess, not only legitimize their own rule, but to maintain social order. It wasn't really about finding, new medications, new weapons, new economic growth. And it's the scientific revolution that has enabled us to understand the world around us, to explore it, and also to improve it, right? And also, I guess, bring it closer together. The British historian and scholar Herbert Butterfield said that the scientific revolution outshines everything since the rise of Christianity and reduces the Renaissance and Reformation to the rank of mere episodes. And I think he's probably right. All things considered, it's been the single biggest driver of improvement to quality of life. But the question then becomes, what changed 500 years ago to kind of spark this revolution and to sort of shake us out of the dark ages? I think there are three things, right? Firstly, humans accepted that they didn't know everything. And almost as importantly as that, they also accepted that the things that we thought we knew could be proven wrongs. So, no concept, no idea, no theory was sort of sacred or beyond challenge. Then, having kind of admitted that ignorance, we aim to obtain new knowledge by gathering observations and using tools to connect those observations into, I guess, what we would call sort of theories, quite comprehensive theories. And then we use that knowledge to create power in the form of new technologies. And this is codified by the scientific method, right? A way to systematically test theories and prove or disprove them in a way that became really widely accepted. And this is what the method sort of looks like. So every breakthrough starts with a question, maybe a research question, and then a belief is stated about what we think the answer to that question is. That's our hypothesis. Then experiments are run in order to test, to prove, or maybe disprove that hypothesis. The results of those tests are assessed, and ultimately we can draw conclusions about what we've learned, and that goes on and on and on, right? So what has this got to do with corporate innovation, startup innovation, innovating with your own organizations? Well, I want to tell you a story about kind of the original gangsters of corporate innovation. So we're going to go back to 1744. There were two Scottish Presbyterian priests, Alexander Webster, Robert Wallace, and they posed their own research question using the scientific method in a business context. And the research question that they had was, how might we create an insurance fund to provide the widows and orphans of priests with a pension, essentially? So, pensions are so commonplace now that this doesn't really sound like much of a giant leap, but in 1744, it really was a new sort of financial product, a new financial instrument. And their hypothesis was that all the priests in Scotland would contribute a small part of their income to the fund. The money then would be invested in different securities, and if one of the depositors, i.e. the kind of priests, died, then his widow would receive dividends from the funds so that she could live comfortably until the end of her life. And a really, really good proposition. I think we'd all probably go for that in 1744. But there was a lot of unknowns around the business model, right, and how much capital they needed to raise. So, they didn't know how much each priest would need to contribute each year into this fund. They didn't really know how many priests were likely to die every year. They had a big assumption around that. They didn't know how many widows and orphans might survive the priests, and how many years I guess they would sort of live for and sort of outsurvive their husbands. So in order to find out, rather than relying on blind faith, going back to the scientific method again, they decided to run an experiment. So they turned to this chap. This is Colin McLaurin, known as Colin with the good hair. So he was a professor of maths at the University of Edinburgh, and together they collected data on deceased priests and ran their experiment this way. So they wanted more information on, what age they passed away, how many priests roughly would sort of die each year. And they learned that although a single event, so the death of a particular person or a particular priest, for example, is quite difficult to predict, it is possible to predict the outcome of many similar events with much more accuracy. So in other words, it's impossible to predict when a certain person is going to die, but it's quite accurate to predict how many priests the church would be short of over a given year. And for the experiment, Wallace and Webster used this. So this is the so-called mortality table. This was created about 50 years prior to 1744, and it's essentially an analysis of births and deaths that said that the death probability this year for a 20-year-old man is 1 in 100, for example, and for a 50-year-old man is 1 in 39 based on this. So looking at this data, the results showed that on average in Scotland, 27 out of 930 priests would die in any given year, and that would leave 18 widows. 5 of those who died would not be mourned by widows, but would leave sort of young children, and also 2 of those who were sort of would get remarried, and they would leave children under the age of 16 for the previous marriage. So this was a fairly sort of accurate, fairly detailed forecast. And then what they wanted to do is calculate how much time would pass before the widow's death or her eventual sort of remarriage. So they were able to determine how much money should be paid into the fund by participants to provide for their loved ones that have survived them. And they worked out that paying £2, 12 shillings and 2 pence a year, that's what it would take for a priest to guarantee his widow sort of £10 a year, ultimately in the form of a drawdown, which is a pretty solid amount for those times. And the conclusion that they got to was that they successfully predicted that by 1765, the Trust for Widows and Orphans of the Scottish Church priests would raise capital of £58,300. And indeed, that year, the capital reached was only £1, sort of less than that amount. So they'd successfully used the scientific method to remove the amount of risk that they had in the business model, to reduce the amount of uncertainty they had about launching this new fund, and ultimately to get their idea to market, right? And now this Webster and Wallace fund is known by another name, Scottish Widows. So it's one of the biggest insurance pension companies in the world. They've got market capitalization of £100 billion now, and happily, they'll insure anyone who wants to buy a policy, not just priests and Scottish widows. But this experiment-based approach to testing these leap of faith assumptions has been borrowed from the scientific method, right? And it's still in use today. So if we fast forward all the way to 2011, the approach to testing these big business assumptions through experimentation was really codified by a chap called Eric Ries in his book, The Lean Startup. And in essence, The Lean Startup is about innovating for business through a scientific mindset, right? So instead of doing what most big traditional companies do, sort of blundering along, flying blind, proceeding by trial and error, but not really learning from the errors, investing huge amounts of time and money building things that nobody really wants. This provides an alternative, right? It's a scientific way of quickly finding and testing ideas that will help you to build a sustainable sort of business. And it's the method that we use here at Future Foundry to help clients to find new growth, ultimately to develop new ventures, to develop new products, new services. If you haven't read The Lean Startup, I would definitely recommend it as a really great starting point for understanding innovation methodology. And I guess through this lens, we can sort of see startups, more scale-ups now, more large corporations like Facebook, is essentially, Mark Zuckerberg's experiment to determine two big leap of faith assumptions, right? Can I build a large collection of people's time and attention for free through sort of viral growth? That was the sort of early stage assumption number one. And then assumption number two, if I have a massive asset in the form of people's time and attention, can I make money by selling that time and attention back to advertisers? I mean, Meta's a much larger company now, but these are the two sort of hypotheses and experiments that Facebook were running and raising venture capital money to run for years. You could also look at Netflix as just a big experiment to discover if it's possible to make a profitable and sustainable business around the concept of renting DVDs by mail, as it was then, and now obviously by streaming movies online. And Google with the driverless car program is an experiment to find out, well, one, is it possible to build a safe driverless car? And two, if we could do that, will anyone want to buy it and use it? And both of those big leaps of faith assumptions are things that need testing, right? And what Lean Startup does is effectively turns the scientific method that we saw earlier into a method for innovation, right? Just like the scientific method, it's about starting from a place of ignorance, testing the hypotheses that you're able to develop cheaply and quickly as you possibly can, and sort of iterating and shipping until you land on success, right? And the object is to learn as quickly as possible about, what clients, what customers will consider as better, more efficient than existing solutions, as something they're willing to buy and be delighted with when they use it. It sounds logical, but it does three things very differently to I guess what traditional sort of 20th century management approaches do. So, the traditional approach to innovation is to build the product, then push it out and out the door and kind of hope that marketing and sales will be able to sell it. But with, very long, expensive periods of building in today's market, this is an approach that is going to lead to developing products and services that customers don't want to buy, even if you invest really heavily in expenditures on sort of advertising, for example. So instead, what we're trying to do with the Lean Startup is build a small piece of the idea, the piece that is of the highest value to your customer or stakeholder in a short work cycle. You evaluate the customer reaction to it. You learn from what the next best thing to build is. You work in successive short cycles and learn as quickly as possible what it is that customers want, and you iterate towards that by providing things that will truly sort of delight them. And it's by working in these short cycles that you can, learn as quickly as possible about what it is that customers want and iterate towards delivering more of that, essentially. So you go through this learning loop, this learn, measure, build loop kind of multiple times, essentially. And this is a huge improvement over traditional management methodologies of like invest a lot, build it, ship it, see if anyone wants it. I guess another way that it's different is that, even if we're not exactly sure about what the product's going to be, you can start by validating the customer's problem and offer to sell magic to them, essentially. And what I mean by that is you can run landing page tests that say, hey, do you have this problem? Would you like to have this problem solved for $49.95? If you can't sell magic to solve that problem, then you definitely can't sell your product, right? It doesn't mean give up, but it means we're not solving the right problem, so we need to find a deeper one. It's an experiment that takes 12 hours, right, to throw up a landing page, to put some ad spend behind it and see if anybody signs up for kind of a waiting list. And yet we still see companies spending multi-millions over multi-year time horizons to kind of find out that customers don't want what they're developing. And I went to the Museum of Failure recently in DC, and it's crammed full of products that have zero levels of desirability from a customer standpoint, completely sort of unfeasible technically and organizationally, and completely unviable from a commercial standpoint. So very, very quick ways that you can test ideas. Landing pages are just one of them. And I guess the final way that it's different is that it's focused first on testing assumptions, specifically those leap of faith assumptions that we looked at. We need to know, can we build this thing? If we build it, will anyone sort of use it or buy it? And if you're, let's say in the diamond business, then your two questions are, can I find a diamond mine where I can extract diamonds? And the second question is that if I had a lot of diamonds, will I be able to sell them to anybody? And here it's the second assumption that's iffy, right? The first isn't that risky at all. If no one really wants the diamonds, there's no point going to kind of find and open a diamond mine. It's the question of desirability really that we need to address. Airbnb is a really great example, and I guess a bit of a cautionary tale of kind of using this method. So Airbnb started with a hypothesis sent from one co-founder, Joe, to another, Brian Chesky, who still runs Airbnb today. They wondered whether they could make money from renting out space in their Bay Area property for a design conference that was going to be in town. Airbnb failed 3 times because they had a notion that they didn't need to admit ignorance. They went with the pre-scientific method and approach of kind of think big, start big, that we see so many legacy companies adopting, but that was a mindset that ultimately didn't take them anywhere. And instead, Airbnb had to come to understand that in order to grow fast and get big, they first needed to validate their assumptions first on a much, much smaller scale than what they were planning to. So Airbnb kind of ran out of cash after 3 failed launches of the business, but rather than giving up, the founding teams of Brian, Joe, a few others, decided to develop this custom-made cereal called Obama-O's and sell it at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago at $40 a box, which feels probably about right for what we're all paying for stuff now, but quite expensive box of cereal. And they managed to raise $30,000 selling this cereal at the DNC. And they needed that $30,000 to start running some experiments and to properly validate the assumptions that they had around Airbnb and what it was on a much smaller scale. And so they started to use lean strategies to reconnect with customers. And what they learned through spending this $30,000 was that many of the listings that they had on Airbnb just weren't catching the attention of potential guests because the owners of those properties have just done a really bad job of, photographing those spaces and presenting those properties. And so they decided to use that $30,000 to step in and help the owners to improve, I guess, not just the quality of the listings, but also the accuracy of them as well. And they experimented with different strategies for how to represent these spaces until they found what worked. So essentially they applied the scientific methods iterative, quantitative approaches, along with design thinking's human-focused discovery, and found a solution to their problem that kind of worked for everyone. So they used the $30,000 to set up a pilot in New York, so just in one city, in the spirit of sort of starting small. They visited all of the hosts and properties that were listed on Airbnb in the city. They personally
Sure you do, you lion sausage. You my little lion.
They personally stayed with each of those hosts, and they wrote proper reviews. They professionally sort of photographed those different places, and it was a big success, right? It was this validation and this learning around why people weren't booking that enabled them to double their revenue within a week. They took the results of those experiments and the conclusions from them back to venture capitalists, and they managed to raise $600,000 in seed capital from Sequoia, and the rest ultimately is history. They're a household name, very credible alternative to hotels, and now the valuation is way over $100 billion with $3.5 billion in revenue. But I think the important thing to say is that it's not just startups in Silicon Valley who are using this scientific method to produce outsized results. If you look at sort of corporations in all different sectors, there are many of them that are investing in innovation capabilities and building units whose remit it is to use this scientific method to find their next breakthrough sort of venture, product, or service. And what these companies, especially the companies that we're working with, what they're essentially doing is effectively splitting off the exploration of new ideas from the exploitation of the existing business. The exploration is done by labs teams. They're focused on using the scientific method to search for ideas which are low risk in innovation terms, but have quite high expected returns. That's in the bottom left-hand box. And then what they're effectively doing is handing over these validated ideas to product teams inside the main business who are focused on growing and kind of scaling those over time. And splitting these out, these two worlds of exploration and exploitation, is really, really important, because exploration is very, very different from exploitation. And this is, I think, what most companies sort of fail to understand. In the world of exploration, you're dealing with much higher degrees of uncertainty than in exploitation. That is the same for any new venture, product, service that you're going to develop. There are a lot of unknowns and a lot of assumptions to test. I guess in the exploration world, the focus really is on search and breakthrough rather than driving efficiency, driving growth, and sort of scaling it. That's what you tend to find more in the sort of BAU sort of exploit world. The financial philosophy is very, very different. It's definitely more venture capital style. Exploration teams take validated learnings to executives who then release funds to sort of iterate further and to learn more. The focus is on funding learning, not necessarily funding revenue growth. Whereas, in the exploit world, we're looking for safe havens and returns usually. The culture is very different. This is, one of the big blockers that most companies sort of come up against, and kind of why they work with venture studios like Future Foundry is that the culture is iterative, it's experimental, it's breakneck speed, whereas in the rest of the organization, usually you can expect quite linear focus on sort of execution and planning. And it also requires a different kind of person. And I think a lot of corporates that we work with struggle to hire the kind of entrepreneurial sort of navigators, really, really good at hiring managers and organizers, but it's definitely entrepreneurs and navigators that you need for this explorative world. And in short, these companies understand that innovation cannot be managed using the same tools and processes that are being used to manage the core business. And this approach is not the preserve of so-called sexy businesses. Centrica, arguably one of the UK's least sexy businesses, developed British Gas Labs way back in 2011, away from the core physically. So this was based in Soho, as well as philosophically, very different from the core. So based in central London, and they're really focused on the rise of smart homes, electric vehicles, distributed energy storage, Industry 4.0, and some of the successes to come out of British Gas Labs, this sort of exploration unit using this scientific innovation method or Hive, smart way to manage the temperature of your home, but also to save money on not heating empty homes. That was one of the first business models and ventures that I ever worked on. There's local heroes, so they're leveraging sort of core Centrica assets to provide home maintenance services on demand for households. They've already got the network of engineers. Why not exploit that asset in a new way? There's British Gas Light, which is a really simplified sort of B2B energy proposition for small businesses. Airlines are an industry where innovation, because of regulation and safety, you might think is thin on the ground. But the Hangar is a lab that I've worked on for Delta, and they're really focused on the things that it can improve. The things that are within their control. So things like airport mobility, in-flight experience, pre-flight customer experience. They've been working on Nomad, so a way to make sure that agents within the airport have got access to everything that they need at their fingertips, so they can be more mobile within those airport environments. MealBot was something that I worked on as a way for passengers to pre-select meals before they fly. Clear as well, which uses biometrics to verify boarding passes and does away with kind of paper and PDFs for sort of domestic flights. And in automotive, 1886 Ventures from Daimler is a really great example of a successful corporate innovation unit focused on applied artificial intelligence, on mobility, green energy, IoT. Mercedes Me came out of 1886 Labs, that's a connected car experience. Car2Go, which is a connected car hire service, and also Movable, which is a multimodal mobility planning and ticketing service connecting everything from tram to train to car sharing, that sort of thing. And what these models enable companies to do is to innovate quite cheaply by separating out exploration from exploitation, recognizing that those two worlds are very, very distinct and creating space for the exploration team to work. They're doing it by using really rapid experimentation and learning-driven work to get to a good place on those ventures, and they're pursuing ideas based on the amount of evidence that they're able to collect throughout the scientific innovation process, right? Not based on the opinion of the highest paid person in the room, or depending on what pet projects they want to pursue. So you could go really deep into sort of innovation accounting here and what people are looking for, but this idea of sort of evidence-driven ideas and ventures is really, really important. And the reason that we're so excited about the corporate innovation space is because corporates have just got this massive advantage over startups when they can get this right. They've got the brand reputation, they've got access to customers and capital that startups would die for, really. And so for innovators inside these companies, what we're trying to show them is that by using the scientific method, they can effectively eliminate pretty much all of the risk from innovation, right? The only capital that they need is the capital to run the experiments. And yes, once they've validated those big leap of faith assumptions and hypotheses around desirability, feasibility, and viability, then you can kind of go and raise money. But that's really for kind of the core business then to sort of grow and scale. So the only real question left to ask about whether or how to get started is kind of how might we? That's the sort of research question that we usually start with here at Future Foundry. It usually starts with a question about a pain that we could solve for customers, a gain that we could create for them, a job that we could help them to get done in a better way. And then we use the scientific method to find out how we do that while moving as quickly as possible, spending as little money as possible, and ultimately eliminating risk and sort of proving out the business case in a pretty sort of upfront way. So I hope that's been helpful. I can't see the chat, but there might be some sort of questions and stuff that we can get to. But yeah, I hope that was a useful overview of the scientific method and how it's being used.
Thank you for that, Jacob. Really, really enlightening session. and really good to hear about kind of the journey that we've gone through in terms of innovation. Eddie, you've got a comment. Did you want to? You've put something in the chat. I don't know if you wanted to speak up.
Well, firstly, thank you, Jacob. Really, really interesting. And I think, the Lottie perspective on this, just, saying out loud for all of our local government colleagues joining today, is that the high bar of innovation in local government shouldn't be just what the best local authority is doing. It should be what is the best approach to innovation, full stop, and what lessons can we learn from elsewhere. So yeah, intrigued to hear other colleagues' comments on to what extent do you recognise the things that Jacob has described in your own organisations. But I guess whilst people are dwelling on that, Jacob, what sort of barriers do you find in organisations where, I imagine particularly at sort of a leadership level, they're struggling to embrace these principles? What marks out the organisations who get this and deploy it well, and those who just fail to really get the benefit of the method that you've described?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that the big overarching barrier is enthusiastic leadership support. There's a lot of people and a lot of companies that we work with who are trying to do this kind of stuff almost under the radar. And they'll get to sort of a validated business model, product, service, and they'll take it back to leadership or take it back to the board or the exco and say, surprise, we've been working on, testing and validating this new product for the last sort of 12 weeks. We'd like some investment in it, please. And the challenge with that is that they very rarely align with the goals, the strategy of the corporate at large. And if it's not being driven, in our experience, by a CEO, you can't pursue it. And in fact, when we're qualifying, which new clients we want to work with at Future Foundry, that is an absolute must, and they have to demonstrate that they've got that enthusiastic support. Once they do, and if they do, there tends to be kind of three sub-blockers. One is around time. It can't be something that people do on a Friday. People talk about the Google sort of 20% rule is largely nonsense. Actually, Google have invested billions in product development over the years. It has to be the job of a core group and team of people. So when people say innovation's everyone's job, yeah, having ideas might be everyone's job, but certainly like extracting the hypotheses and the underlying assumptions in those ideas, experimenting, testing, and validating those, that needs to be the job of kind of a core group of humans. I think the second blocker that we tend to see is risk. You can't, as we've seen, sort of apply the management practices of the 20th century in this environment and kind of expect it to work. And I think whilst most companies understand design thinking, lean startup, agile at a theoretical level, it is still very, very hard to work like that in an organization with existing constraints. And then I think the final thing is, the final sub-blocker is just a level of complexity involved in running experiments when you've got risk and compliance team, a marketing and brand team who are very sort of protective, and when you've got like a legacy technology stack that doesn't allow you to spin up those experiments quickly. And I guess those are the problems that we're trying to solve at Future Foundry, right? We're kind of saying, as long as you've got the support, you don't need the people or the technology stack or the methods. You can just kind of circumvent that, and we'll work with you to run these experiments and test your hypotheses.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think so. I'm just looking at the chat. We've got a question from Michelle, who's asking, do innovation labs work better when they sit separately from the core business? Does it free up innovation or frustrated if not integrated enough to progress the ideas and the experiments?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So our point of view would be, yes, they need to be separate because the cultures, the financial philosophy, the ways of working are so kind of markedly different. So philosophically, I think they need to be separate. I'm not sure geographically necessarily that they need to be separate, especially now. When I was working with Centrica, British Gas Labs couldn't wait to get out of Slough, basically, and just wanted to get into towns. They don't need to be geographically separated, but philosophically, they certainly do need to be, and they need to be sort of ring fenced. But there's a huge caveat, and the caveat is that whoever is the sponsor of that innovation lab or unit needs to be ambidextrous. And by that, what I mean is that they can't only be responsible for the exploration of new ventures, products, and services. They've also got to be the person who's going to bridge those two worlds, right, and take the explorative into the exploitative so that we can kind of grow and scale things. And those leaders are quite rare, actually, because you're searching for people who are able to navigate the inherent uncertainties that exist within the sort of innovation world and grow, scale, navigate the politics and complexity of landing things in sort of an established corporate. So yes, it needs to be separate, but you need to have somebody kind of connecting those two worlds, an ambidextrous leader.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. No, it's really interesting, and it's a great presentation as well. That's helpful.
That's like we've got another question. So I think we've got a comment from Alton in the chat who's saying that the main issue is budgets, which do not allow for even calculated risks and innovation, and the drive for efficiency savings versus invest to save type projects. Jacob, has that come across in kind of the private sector from your experience?
I mean, I would say that limited budgets are probably a good thing, right? Because it means that you're going to have to be super lean and super creative in terms of thinking about the experiments that you're likely to run, and you're not likely to encounter the danger of sort of over-investing in things sort of too early. I guess what is really important and what is a bit of a deal breaker is that eventually there's going to need to be money to invest in a metered funding way. So, at the very beginning of developing any new venture product or service, we're trying to prove problem solution fit, right? Do people really have this problem? And is this a solution that is a better or more efficient way of sort of solving that problem, right? And to find that out should take 4 weeks and something that you can put on your credit card, ultimately, like in terms of budget and sort of tests. And then what we do is kind of take that back and say, look, we've managed to demonstrate problem solution fit. Can we have some more money to now work out whether we've got sort of solution product fit? In other words, can we turn the solution into a commercially viable sort of value proposition? And then we're asking for a bit more money, not a huge amount more, but that usually takes kind of like 8 weeks for us to figure out solution product fit. And then finally, the largest investment that we're asking for is if we can prove solution product fit, can we prove product market fit? Can we get this venture product service into the hands of customers and create value in a sustainable and kind of scalable way? And that is a larger investment. So it's fine to have limited budgets to run experiments at the beginning, with the caveat that there is going to need to be money for you to like build and develop on that experimentation set to increase the level of fidelity of not just the product, but also the experiments that you're running. And we see time and time again, in the corporate world as well, that people have got money to sort of interview customers and to spin up low fidelity prototypes, but they haven't got any money to like launch and scale it. So it's a bit kind of self-defeating, really.
Thank you. Yeah, that kind of resonates with the public sector as well. Eddie, you've got your hand up.
Yes, absolutely. And I can see this comment from Lisa of sharing that a lot of our finance directors in local government have still got very waterfall style, where they want the lockdown budget on every line item you're going to spend sort of the financial year in advance. And that really is difficult. And I think part of the conversation is Lottie's trying to have with some of the finance director groups across London. But I guess another question that is particularly pressing for us, I think, Jacob, is and I imagine must have some parallels in the business world, is we're looking at these incredible lines of service that every local authority is responsible for, you know, sometimes hundreds of different things that local authorities do. And the question for leadership teams and all their colleagues is often, so where do we just need to optimize, tweak what we already do? Where do we need to be running these big, bold experiments to try something quite radical and different? And so I guess, I don't know if you've got any advice on, when you're looking at a business as a whole, where are you spotting for the potential real fruit for those new innovations, as opposed to going, no, you just need to do what you do really well and maintain, or, you know, fix the odd bug here and there. But any thoughts on that front?
Yeah, I think when we start working with clients, some of them will have like a hypothesis around where it is they need to play. Others won't really have much of a thesis, and so, you know, for those that don't, we'll work with them and we'll understand kind of 5 inputs essentially. We'll understand sort of customers, you know, trends, behaviors, problems, that sort of thing as an input. We'll look at competitors, both direct and adjacent, and look at, well, what are competitors doing in this space? You know, what interesting sort of seed, Series A startups are sort of playing here? How are they trying to disrupt sort of businesses as usual? We'll look at tech. So we'll look at sort of universities that we've got partnerships with. We'll look at patent platforms, look at what patents are being registered, what might that mean for how we can work better. We'll also look at investors. So we'll look at, you know, where are people whose job it is to gamble on the future? You know, where are they placing their bets? What does that tell us about where we might be able to play? And then finally, we'll talk to kind of stakeholders, frontline employees, and understand, you know, some of the feedback and problems that they hear. And that helps to give us an entire sort of opportunity set. So we can say, look, this is really where we should be focused. Over the last sort of 15 years, I've become increasingly convinced that if you could only take one of those inputs, it would be customer ultimately, or user, right? Like, it doesn't have to be the person that's kind of paying for the service. And what you're trying to understand is kind of, you know, what problems do they face that are deep and frequent, and do they care enough to pay to solve? That's the advice that we would give to kind of corporate clients. You know, not all problems are created equally. Some problems customers don't care about that much. They're happy to put up with them. They certainly wouldn't pay to solve them. So you've got to find depth and frequency of pain. And that essentially should be the starting point. You know, can we make something that is really expensive today cheaper? Can we make something today that is really slow faster? Usually that tends to be the jumping off point.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And the bit that resonates there, I think I'll ponder on this more, the phrase like the depth and the depth and something of pain
and frequency. Yeah.
Depth and frequency. And I imagine that might be a concept we could translate for some of our service areas, those residents who are really feeling either being not failed by the sector, but, you know, not getting the level of support they need, or finding it so hard to access what they need, with that expectation that it should be there. Thank you.
Yeah, we're actually building an AI tool because everyone. No, we're not. We're doing it because there's a really good use case for it. We're building an AI tool to scrape publicly available sentiment around underserved needs, underserved problems. We're using it in our work with clients. We're likely going to let clients have access to it and use it themselves. So they can put in certain parameters, they can surface key problems, they can analyze depth and frequency and use that as a jumping off point for new projects. So yeah, as and when that's available, would love to see what the Lottie team and sort of colleagues in local authority make of it. We'll share it with you.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely look forward to that. Any other questions? Please don't be shy, raise your hand, or feel free to just ask your question. I'm taking that as a sign. There are no more questions. I was going to say I'm prepared to stay silent for as long as it takes, but if there are no more questions, oh, there you go. We've got a hand up. Michelle, please do jump in.
Hi there. Yeah, I was just going to pick up on the earlier comment about budgets which don't allow for calculated risks in innovation. Is there any way that any recommendations you can think of ways we can make a case for that in terms of how it, investing to save type projects and innovation type projects? Does anyone have any tips about ways to make a business case for that?
I think there's I might not be best placed to answer this, because I don't understand your world as much as kind of the corporate world. But one of the things that the people that we work with and us as a team have to spend quite a lot of time doing is educating the business and the finance teams in particular on the need to play more of a venture capital style role. And that is a philosophical shift that is quite big for them to make, really, because you're asking them not to invest in things with like a really clear known ROI. You're asking them to invest in the exploration for things that have got a really clear sort of ROI, essentially. And so we try to get them thinking not about which 1 to 3 things do we invest in really heavily this year. We ask them to think about the 100 things that they could place a large number of small bets on over the course of the year in order to understand which winners emerge. In innovation, we can't pick the winners. The winners emerge themselves, right? And so if we can't pick the winners, we have to place like a large number of small bets to see which ones emerge. And so I would say that philosophically, that's the sort of journey that we have to go on with our sort of CFO and finance team clients. Not an easy one to go on at all.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I like the bets analogy. That's a good way to think of it. And as you said, the size of it as well, but not investing too much in any one thing, because I think that's something that finance people do understand. Spreading your risk.
Yeah, you're essentially looking for it's easier, I think, to kind of raise money to go and search for solutions when kind of the problems are known. So if you do know the problems, then you could say, look, we want to invest in solving these problems. Like we don't know how. One of the things I think is quite a hard place to start from is like we don't even know the problems yet. It's like unknown problem, unknown solution. That is quite hard to get backing for. But if you can quantify the value of solving a problem, that could be a good place to start.
I think we've got one more question in the chat. So Ruth is asking if you have any examples of local government patenting ideas and selling them on. Eddie is just.
Again, this might be outside your particular domain specialism, Jacob, unless you do happen to know. If not, I can come in briefly.
Yeah, I don't, but if there was, I'd imagine they'd be on the west coast of the US.
It's a good shout, and I think we could maybe take that one away, Ruth. I think yes, we'd most likely have to look internationally to find examples, and yes, I think the culture of the West Coast, US would lend itself to that. In the UK, I think Kirklees Council, if any of you who've interacted with an organisation called CC2I, which essentially crowdsource equity funding for new businesses that solve local government problems, but I don't think that's retaining sort of patents as such. More common is sort of creating fully owned subsidiaries. So if you look at Greenwich Council owns the subsidiary DG Cities, which does lots of smart city pilots. So clearly lots of local authorities looking at sort of creative revenue sources, albeit some have also had their hands burned quite significantly from that approach. But we'll have a think and see if we can find some specific examples for you.
Thank you very much. I'm interested in hearing from others about how the process for doing it. I know there's Innovate UK, which could perhaps be helpful, but it's actually navigating the different statutory and legal requirements that local government have for that kind of thing. So thank you.
I mean, that would be a great way to self-fund innovation, though. As a flywheel, that's quite powerful, isn't it? If you can essentially identify problems, develop better and more effective solutions to those, with the knowledge that you're always going to spin those out and commercialize them. That could be super powerful. Yeah.
Absolutely. It sounds like Hertfordshire Council may have done that for some of their innovations. Adrian, I don't know, I don't want to put you on the spot, but did you want to share a little bit about that, or maybe we can follow up afterwards?
So I know practically nothing. As a conference with somebody from Hertfordshire yesterday, and we were talking about innovation, and they said we've actually got some patents on some of their assistive technology goods and services they've developed to support their residents, and are hoping to sell to other local authorities and indeed to care homes. And there was somebody from a care home provider at the same event, and I saw them huddled in the corner talking about how they might exploit the patented technologies in their 300 care homes in the UK.
That's
Super.
interesting. Universities do it quite well, don't they? That could be a model, like when you look at how universities kind of spin off and commercialize internal sort of R&D.
Super interesting. Thanks for sharing that, Adrian. I think if you have a named contact, we would be happy to follow up, and it sounds like others might find that really helpful. I think we've come to the end of this session, so I just want to say thank you very much to you, Jacob, for this really, really enlightening session. I definitely learned a lot about the origins of innovation, but also kind of how practically some of the world's most successful companies are implementing it. And thank you very much to all of you for being here. We will share the slides and the recording afterwards, but for now, have a good rest of the day. See you in the next session. Take care, everyone.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone. Bye.